Greetings. My name is Dr. Olivera-Figueroa. Today I'll be sharing with you a study conducted at Yale University titled The Role of Time Perspective and Acculturative Stress on Stress Coping Responses of Puerto Ricans living in the mainland United States and the island of Puerto Rico. The aim of this study is to assess the predictability of acculturative stress and time perspectives on the adaptive and maladaptive stress coping styles of healthy and treatment-seeking Puerto Ricans living in Connecticut, as well as on the island of Puerto Rico. The first hypothesis for this study was that past positive, present hedonistic, future, and the deviation to negative time perspective coefficient, which is an indicator of being balanced in time perspective, could predict adaptive coping strategies while controlling for treatment, non-treatment seeking status, as well as state of residence, being Puerto Rico or Connecticut. The second hypothesis was that acculturative stress, past negative, present fatalistic, and the deviation to balance time perspective revised coefficient, which is an indicator of being negative in time perspective, will predict maladaptive coping strategies while controlling for treatment, non-treatment seeking status, as well as state of residence. The third hypothesis was that Puerto Ricans living in Connecticut will apply more frequently maladaptive coping strategies than those living on the island of Puerto Rico. The fourth hypothesis was that acculturative stress will mediate the influence of deviation to negative time perspective on adaptive coping. Similarly, acculturative stress will mediate the influence of deviation to balance time perspective revised coefficient on maladaptive coping. And the fifth and final hypothesis is that acculturative stress and the deviation to negative time perspective will mediate the influence of state on adaptive coping. Similarly, acculturative stress and deviation to balance time perspective revised coefficient will mediate the influence of state on maladaptive coping. In terms of methods, participants were recruited for this study from community centers and clinics in Connecticut. At that region, 138 adults participated, 38 of which were men and 100 of which were women, between the ages of 18 to 78, with a mean age being 47 years. From Puerto Rico, we recruited participants from gyms, churches, and clinics. Particularly, we recruited at the island of Puerto Rico 197 adults, 82 of which were men, 115 of which were women, between the ages of 21 to 79, with the mean age being of 40 years. In terms of outcome measures, we administered the Simbaru time perspective inventory through a brief version containing 15 items, which were translated and culturally adapted to the Spanish dialect of Puerto Rico. From this inventory, we calculated the deviation to balance time perspective revised coefficient, DVTPR, as well as the deviation from a negative time perspective coefficient, DNTP. To assess acculturative stress, we administered the acculturative distress scale. And to assess stress coping styles, we administered the brief cope inventory. For statistic analysis, we conducted hierarchical linear regressions addressing several contouring variables such as age, gender, state, mental health conditions, medical conditions, and the category of being treatment seeking or healthy, as well as the 5 traditional time perspective tendencies: past negative, past positive, present hedonistic, present fatalistic, and future, as well as the two coefficients, DVTPR, DNTP, as well as acculturative stress. We got the first regression we calculated was with adaptive coping as the outcome variable. From this regression analysis, only the deviation to negative time perspective coefficient, DNTP, which is an indicator of being balanced in time perspective, significantly predicted adaptive coping at a level of 0.001. The second regression analysis was conducted with the same predictor variables on the outcome variable of maladaptive coping. Here, present hedonistic significantly predicted maladaptive coping at a level of 0.019. Deviation to balance time perspective revised coefficient, the DVTPR, statistically significantly predicted maladaptive coping at a level of 0.017. And acculturative stress also significantly predicted maladaptive coping at a level of 0.001. Furthermore, we conducted one-way ANOVAs with the variables as a function of country in order to test our third hypothesis. This analysis revealed significant differences between the states in several categories, such as mental health conditions, medical conditions, acculturative stress, DBT-PR, DNTP, past positive, present fatalistic, future adaptive coping, and maladaptive coping. As it can be seen here, in all these variables, participants in Connecticut exhibited higher scores than those at the island of Puerto Rico. Important to note, there was one exception, and that being adaptive coping. In that one, the participants located at the island of Puerto Rico exhibited higher scores than those at the island at the state of Connecticut. Importantly, a lack of statistical significance was observed in this analysis on present hedonistic and past negative. For the examination of our fourth hypothesis, we conducted a mediator analysis with DNTP as independent variable, acculturative stress as mediator, and adaptive coping style as dependent variable. Across this analysis, acculturative stress appeared to do not mediate the influence of DNTP on adaptive coping, since the indirect effect did not reach significance. Additionally, we also conducted a mediator analysis with DBT-PR as independent variable, acculturative stress as mediator, and maladaptive coping style as dependent variable. Here, acculturative stress partially mediated the influence of DBT-PR on maladaptive coping style, since the indirect effect reached significance. In order to examine our fifth hypothesis, we conducted a mediator analysis with state, that being Puerto Rico or Connecticut, as independent variable, DNTP and acculturative stress as mediators, and adaptive coping as dependent variable. Here, DNTP did appear to mediate the influence of state on adaptive coping, since the indirect effect reached significance, but in contrast, acculturative stress did not mediate this influence. In the last mediation analysis, state was the independent variable, DBT-PR and acculturative stress were mediators, and maladaptive coping was a dependent variable. Here, DBT-PR and acculturative stress appear to totally mediate the influence of state on maladaptive coping, since the indirect effect reached significance. In summary, all hypotheses were either partially supported or totally supported. First, for hypothesis 1, adaptive coping strategies were only predicted by DNTP. In the second hypothesis, maladaptive coping strategies were predicted by acculturative stress, present hedonistic, and DBT-PR. In the third hypothesis, Puerto Ricans living in Connecticut did apply more frequently maladaptive coping strategies than those living on the island of Puerto Rico. In the fourth hypothesis, acculturative stress did not mediate the influence of DNTP on adaptive coping. However, acculturative stress partially mediated the influence of DBT-PR on maladaptive coping style. And the final hypothesis was partially supported. DNTP appeared to indeed mediate the influence of state on adaptive coping, but in contrast, the acculturative stress did not mediate its influence. Finally, DBT-PR and acculturative stress did appear to totally mediate the influence of state on maladaptive coping. In terms of discussion, the DNTP, which is an indicator of being balanced in time perspective, appeared to be very important in applying adaptive coping strategies. While acculturative stress and the DBT-PR, which is an indicator of being negative in time perspective, predicted maladaptive coping, it is surprising that present hedonistic did enhance maladaptive coping. This effect of present hedonistic may be influenced by the correlations that have been previously been documented of present hedonistic on aversive substance use, which can lead to negative outcomes. Finally, the most important factors in the explanation of coping styles across Puerto Rican populations appear to be acculturative stress and the time perspective profiles of balanced and unbalanced time perspective as measured by the respective coefficients, DNTP and DBT-PR. With this, I conclude my presentation. Please, for anyone that would like to follow up and ask me any questions about the study, feel free to write to me at my email address, which is shown here. My first name, learning.olivera@aya.el.edu. In conclusion, I thank you all for attending this presentation. I hope it has been of your liking, and I hope to see you all soon. Have a good day.